Well, so anyone that has a question can raise their hand, but we'll start with people have been texting in questions using this app. So we'll start with the one that was the most popular question, which was, Ken or any of the panel, would you comment on the biblical, what does the Bible have to say about retirement?
The Bible doesn't speak specifically to retirement as we know it. Retirement as we know it is a modern construct. Retirement as we know it is a modern construct. But the Bible does say a lot about how we should treat the elderly with respect and with dignity. I think we have fallen into a trap. This notion that somehow people should be able to work for 35 years and then live in a retirement for 25 years and have there not be an economic impact makes no sense. And this notion that we should all live independently in our retirement and live on golf courses and spend the rest of our days playing golf is a nonsense to me. What the Bible would suggest is that in retirement we should change from working for money to mentoring. We should be nurturing the next generation. That's the biblical model. And it's the single biggest untapped resource in the church today, in my opinion, is retired people. We don't respect them amply, and we don't use the wisdom that they bring to the party. And when I was at Oxford, I'll tell you this. The number one thing students asked for was relationships with older people in their fields. I kid you not. That's what they wanted more than anything. So there's nothing wrong with retirement. If you choose to retire, God bless you. But I think the commercial image we have of retirement is not a biblical one. And the other thing is, if I could wave a magic wand and pass one law in this country, I wouldn't allow any house in this country to be built in the future that didn't have a granny flat attached to it. Because we are sending our old people off when our young people need them the most.
I would add, and there's not a lot to add to that, but I would add this. I've been asked this question often, and I say I give this answer somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it is only a little bit tongue-in-cheek. And that is, like Ken, I find nowhere in the Bible where retirement is talked about. I do not believe that at age 65 we get a hall pass to spend the rest of our lives focused on ourselves. I don't think God intended that. Now, there will be a lot of people who will do that because they may not know Christ, or maybe some will do it because they do but don't understand. I think that the years that we have from the time we came to know Christ, He saved and bought our lives with His death and resurrection. Therefore, we're His 24/7, 365 for 95 years or however long we live. Therefore, those years should be given to Him, mentoring, caring for the least, the lost, the lonely, whatever, but they're not to focus on ourselves. That sort of is actually what happened in the garden, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a balance, but that would be my response. Lisa, anything you want to add to that?
I was just going to say, one of the challenges I see is that it seems like the marketplace kind of has a cutoff. Well, whether or not you may be able to continue to work, but they kind of force you to retire.
And I just think I don't know where that mindset came from. I just don't think it's biblical. And I can understand that, look, sometimes you have to make room for the next generation. That's normal, that people want to move up the corporate ladder, etc. So maybe people should gracefully say, I'm going to, quote unquote, retire from paid employment. But then at least, like I said, sit on a board, become part of a mentoring group, do work at the church. Retirement should, and by the way, this is factual. Most CEOs of Fortune 500 companies who retire are dead within 5 years.
If you think about what we've heard from Ken this weekend, it seems to me we have a coming opportunity / great concern. Wouldn't it be just like God, when those times occur, for Him to use those who are free and available to care for others? And there will be others, and there are many of us who will be at some point free from work, as we would define it corporately and professionally. But there's going to be a tremendous amount of work, it seems to me, to be done if half of what we've heard this weekend comes to fruition.
We have a question here in the back. Oh, sorry.
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned earlier, but not by name, that you think that a UBI, a universal basic income, or some sort of tool to redistribute wealth is kind of inevitable. One, do you think it's inevitable? Most of the tech titans are kind of pushing it now because they see this growing problem of a lot of workers with a lot of time on their hands who could vote them, or vote for politicians who would regulate their industries. But if we have a guaranteed source of income and all this time on our hands, but our modern economy is built on consumerism, people buying products, but those people don't make enough money to buy products, do we essentially end up with this? Like, how do we deal with that? Not just, okay, we have all this time on our hands, but we have time on our hands and no money. Well, no money means we don't consume things, and the robots that build things don't have customers. So how do we deal with that circular?
So the universal basic income concept isn't inevitable. It's just one of many ideas. But at some point, if you have a systemic situation where there is simply no opportunity for gainful employment, you have to figure out how people are going to be taken care of, or the social unrest will be, it'll be devastating. So that's just one of many ideas that's out there. The answer to your question is, what happens then? The gig economy would fill the void, almost certainly. And you're already starting to see the gig economy starting to happen with people driving Uber and doing other things like that, working in Walmart, whatever it might be, just doing other things to keep themselves active, etc. But the fact of the matter is, the market will take care of a lot of these things, but the market can't take care of everything. And this is the single greatest challenge we have, in my opinion, in the entire developed world, the entire G20, is that we have begun to live under the illusion that the market can fix everything. It can't. It's a lot better at handling most things, but it can't do everything. So we're going to have to figure out, on a very pragmatic level, how do we let the market do what the market does? But then how do we ensure that where the market can't solve the problem, we create a group response which is fair and workable? And that's going to take a different kind of thinking than we have today. So if I had the answer, I'd be a zillionaire, because I'd write a book on that. There isn't, because we're not sure exactly how bad it's going to be or when it's coming down the pike. But UBI is being tested in some Nordic countries right now, as you may know. And the jury is out as to whether it works.
This is to anyone up there. I'd like for you to consider the single parent who is working in a toxic work environment. No laws are being broken, but I know there's many people in here who know what I'm talking about. What advice could you give that single parent? And by the way, they do not hold a position in management.
Jim, I'm going to, knowing you as I do, and I know the wealth of experience you have in this area, can you run that rabbit down the hole just a little bit further to give us a little more thought relative to where you're thinking?
No.
It might be a good idea.
I've known him most of my life, so he can.
Maybe we should have a woman answer that.
I'm talking about the individual who doesn't have resources, who doesn't have power in the workforce. This is not a good analogy. A worker bee.
Right.
They're working in a hostile environment. No laws are being broken, but they're being berated, put down, ignored, worked without respect. And the single parent is in a unique position, and it's not a good one. What advice could you give that individual?
I'm not a single parent, but I have been a single woman working. Spent most of my life actually as a single woman, and having to work your way up in different environments. And I think that's where you depend on your community, and hopefully that individual would have a church family or a biological family or extended family that they could depend on, but that's where I think you have to lean on the support of those around you that are close to you, family, friends.
I would say the same thing, Jim. I think the community of the church would be critical. And I think within that community, you could get advice in certain different areas of expertise if needed. That would be certainly one thing.
Yeah, and lastly, I'll just say this. At the end of the day, advice doesn't go a long way for that person. Advocacy does. This is where courage and justice come to the fore. If we know of these situations, we have to be advocates for these people. That's what Jesus tells us to do. Why do you think Jesus said, treat the widow and the orphan and the sojourner with grace? Because it was the widow, the orphan, and the sojourner who had no power and who was most likely to be abused. And Jesus commands us to be the voice of the voiceless in those environments. So it's risky, because whenever you put your head above the parapet, you're taking a risk. But I think that's a classic example of when a Christian has to take a risk.
Thank you.
You can ask anything.
I'm concerned how bad our health system has gotten. Specifically, I mean, when you go to an emergency room like St. Mary's, you get very bad. You have to wait 6 hours for them to test you. You're sent to a hospital where you get a really bad treatment. So I don't know what's going on here. What's happened, of course, since Medicare came out, the hospitals are buying everybody up where they have a monopoly, and you just simply get very bad treatment in hospitals, particularly St. Mary's, where I've had very bad experiences.
I'll take that one. That's why I keep forgetting I have a mic.
He wants two mics.
I'm sorry. I am not going to give you the answer I'd like to give you because I don't want to get political. But I will just say this. A lot of the fear-mongering that's out there about quote-unquote socialized medicine is exactly that. It's fear-mongering. I'm not a socialist. I'm a capitalist. But I'm also a pragmatist. And I spent 23 years in a country where they have what we in this country call socialized medicine. By the way, no one else uses that term. We use it because socialism is pejorative. But I lived in a situation where the healthcare system was universal. Let's use that term. They did a survey of every single patient who used the NHS, everyone, whether it was heart surgery or you just went in because you had a cough. And they did it over the period of about 6 months. And the NHS in the UK has an 87% approval rating. And the cost per capita for the healthcare in the UK is $3,900 US per person. The cost per capita in the US is $10,000 per person. And if you look at all the statistics, longevity, infant mortality, cancer survival rates, heart disease, diabetes, everything, we don't get better results in America than they get there. Now, does that mean we should go to a universal socialized system? I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is pragmatism goes a long way in these areas. And I would hope as Christians, we would at least encourage people to have open minds and open hearts when it comes to things like healthcare, and not go into tribes, not go into camps, and not make it it's either got to be this way or it's got to be that way solution. The fact of the matter is, all we should care about is what's the best possible solution for the best value for everybody. That's my humble opinion. Okay? So I'm not endorsing the NHS or a socialized system. I'm not endorsing the current system here. I'm saying nothing about Obamacare. Okay? Because I didn't live here when Obamacare came into effect. All I'm saying is the point you're making is really important in terms of how we should think about that kind of economic issue. Maybe we need to be a little more open-minded, a little more compassionate, and a little bit more pragmatic, because one thing's certain, current system ain't working. Ain't working.
I just wanted to say something that everyone knows. Richmond has crossover clinic.
I don't know what that means. Oh, praise God. Praise God. Yeah.
Ben, can we get this mic on? It's on.
Hi. I was just curious on what your opinion was of the whole idea of how your dollar is the biggest vote that you make in the kind of world that you want to live in, I guess, especially in our capitalist consumer society. Do you think like the individual choices we make about what we buy will actually change on a national scale, even if it feels like no one else around you is really making those choices?
Guys, do you want me to take that? It's up to you. I'm only going to answer that because it was an economic question. I don't want to dominate the thing. That's why I keep turning to these guys, because I want them to answer the question. Let me just say this. What I said earlier about every single economic decision you make is a moral decision, I stand by. Whether or not the cumulative effect of individual moral decisions will have an impact on the general economy, which is what I think you're asking, the answer is just look at examples of where it's happened. Right? There are things we used to do that we don't do anymore because there was a groundswell of a change of attitude. For instance, people don't drink and drive anymore, basically. Right? And it wasn't because the law was always there that you can't drive drunk. But it became a social stigma to not drive drunk. And there are other things, again, economic choices. Look at do you know what one of the single fastest growing areas of chemicals is? Green chemicals, chemicals that don't pollute the environment. I know because I ran a chemical company, all right? And in fact, I'll give you this story. This is a great story. Thank you for reminding me. I ran a paint company, okay? I ran a paint company in Europe. And we made the paint that goes on automobiles in body shops. It's very technical. Believe it or not, it's a very high-tech business to make paint to go on cars in a body shop. And the EU passed a law. And it said, as of the year 2000, no solvent-based paints will be allowed. They'll be banned. And every single manufacturer in the industry used solvents as the base for our paints. So what did we do? We formed a corporate, or an industry thing, and we went to the European Parliament and we said, oh no, you can't do this, you can't do this. And the European Parliament said, you'll figure it out. So then what happened? Then it was like, oh my gosh, this is really going to happen. And all of a sudden, all the companies said, the first people to figure this out are going to do great. And my company was the first one to figure it out. We came up with a water-based paint to put on cars and body shops. It covered the cars better, so you had a better finish on the product. It was green to make, green to use, cheaper to make, cheaper to use. We made more money, the body shops made more money, and the environment was spared the effect of the solvents. So it just takes a combination of a little bit of political will and a little bit of entrepreneurial creativity, and yes, you can move the needle. That's a true story.
Fear.
Sorry?
And fear.
There was a little fear in there.
You mentioned very briefly about how Christianity thrives when it's in the margins. Can you say more about what that would look like in our current world and current environment?
Only this. I think we do ourselves a disservice when we get sucked into these culture wars. I don't think it's helpful. I think we find ourselves justifying things that are unjustifiable, defending things that are indefensible, using language that is not Christian language. I think we do much better when we speak the truth in love and we don't try to be the power system. We let the power of the gospel do its own work. And I just think it's a better Christian witness when we do that than when we try to influence things in order to create a Christian utopia. I was in the Massachusetts State House speaking to a Christian lobbyist the other day. And his whole raison d'etre, his whole life is he wants Christian legislation. And I admire the guy because he's very committed and he works really hard. And he wants pastors to support him from the pulpit. And I said, look, I'm going to be honest with you. Your job as a lobbyist is to influence legislation. My job as a pastor is to inform the discussion. And I think when we inform the discussion using the language of love and faith and hope and virtue, we do the gospel a greater service than when we get down into the trenches, because what happens is we conform instead of being transformed. That's my own humble opinion. You're free to disagree with that.
I'll just add one thing to that, if I may. One of the things Needle's Eye has been really, I think, committed to over a fairly long period of time is trying to be apolitical. We have at times had to fight hard to do that, but I really believe it. If you get me alone and you ask me questions politically, I mean, I have a political science degree. I'll do that with you. But I don't think God is a Republican or a Democrat.
Amen.
I used to have, years ago, a board member who really did. And we had to have a couple of serious conversations about that. I think what he's concerned about is just what Ken's talked about: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control lived out day to day. So it seems to me, I was talking to someone just as recent, I think, as yesterday. I remember a time in our political history where there was a lot of civility on both sides of the aisle. There is little, if any, now. And I really think Christians need to take the lead on trying to replenish halls of government with civility. So that's my addition to what you said, Ken.
Hi, this is a question primarily for Dr. Barnes, but for all three of you, actually. Dr. Barnes, you talked in your discussion about the Industrial Revolution and technology of the future, about how the Industrial Revolution led to some very negative outcomes in terms of social unrest and things. I'm wondering if you could take it a step further and comment on how we could avoid, how we can embrace a theology of loving the workers in our industries truly and well, without leaning towards the tenets of the communist revolution that induced a lot of death and destruction in the world, and a lot of the opposites of where the free market could be good, and it induced the worst possible outcomes in those countries. And it's a question for the other two of you as well, perhaps just commenting on your own experiences and how you've treated workers and seen how the gospel can impact treating workers well. But if all of you could comment on how we can form that good theology without going to an extreme that will induce death and destruction, basically.
That's a great question. Let me first of all say that the worst expression ever created was the term human resource. I hate that term. I hate it. What does it do? It objectifies us. It makes us just one other asset in the business. That's the traditional work as a dish utility model. I much preferred personnel because persons were involved. And the baseline here is to treat people as people, not as human assets. It's just a mindset. We've just got to stop that. And the funny thing is, enlightened businesses do better than unenlightened businesses. There's a lot of research on this. And a friend of mine wrote a book on this. If you take these virtuous companies like Chick-fil-A and some of the others, and you look at how they have performed in terms of their return on invested capital, one of the most common metrics we use in business, and you compare it to the companies that we have also highlighted that have been very unvirtuous, and the virtuous companies don't only leave them in the dust, they leave the entire Dow Industrial Average in the dust. Virtuous companies do better. And one of the reasons they do better is because they treat their people justly. And happy employees are more productive. Well-paid employees are more productive. How many people here have heard of Adam Smith? When I talk about Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, great. Most people quote Adam Smith completely out of context. completely misunderstand Adam Smith because they only have ever read parts of Wealth of Nations. And they take out of context the kind of ethical egoism that he talks about with the invisible hand and, it's not for the benevolence of the baker and the butcher that we get our meal, but from himself and just blah, blah, blah. And they completely forget that he wrote a book 20 years before called Moral Sentiments, in which he lays the foundation for Wealth of Nations in that we are all moral beings, and every human being, this is him saying it directly, every human being, no matter how corrupt we think they are, should care about, and endemically as a creature of God, does care about the common good. And so you can't understand Wealth of Nations if you haven't read Moral Sentiments. And I unpack that in the new book. I unpack it so that people understand it's not anti-capitalist to say we're going to pay people more than the market rate. Because this is a classic example of where the market can't do it on its own. Because people aren't assets, they're people. And so sometimes we have to interrupt the invisible hand, and we have to manipulate it to ensure that people don't exploit other human beings. And it upsets a lot of people when you say that, because a lot of people think we should treat employees like every other asset in the market. And I've been saying, no, that is a moral mistake. And I've got Adam Smith on my side.
This is just a small thing, but I feel like, at my work, we have some very high-powered executives, and then we have a lot of people who provide services to keep the employees happy. And I think it's really important. I try to be really sensitive to the woman who's cleaning the bathroom, or the security guard, or the installer who's doing a job that I'm working on. I think it's important to treat everybody with respect and recognize their value as a human being, regardless of their position or how much they make or where they are in the organizational structure. So I think that goes a long way. And I know that even in my own work, when you do treat people well, it comes back to you in other ways, and they will help you. And so I just think that's a big thing that we can do. If you're not in a position really to be an influencer, so to speak, you can treat others with respect and see that ripple throughout the culture of your place of work.
Amen. Yep. Couple more? Yeah.
It was mentioned earlier about mentorship and the millennial generation's interest in receiving mentorship. So my question is, I'd like to hear from the panel about modes of mentorship that are effective, whether they be the conventional ones you might think about in terms of the workplace, or non-conventional. Just sort of a list of ideas. Well, how can people of the older generations effectively engage? What kind of environments, and how can they perhaps be created, and things like that, just to get creative thoughts flowing.
Well, there's a whole chapter on mentoring in the book. What book is that? I will only say this, and then turn it back over to the panel. The biggest mistake we make with mentoring is we think it can be done serendipitously, and it can't. That's not mentoring. Mentoring needs to be intentional. And we need to train people on how to mentor. Because someone who doesn't know how to mentor can do more damage than good. Okay? Some people don't have good personalities for mentoring because they're control freaks or whatever. And they think that mentoring gives them carte blanche to create a clone of themselves. That's not mentoring either. Good mentoring is not as easy as it sounds to do, but the rewards are exponential. And as much reward for the mentor as for the mentoree. Ask anyone who's done mentoring and they will tell you that. Tomorrow, I got an email from a text from a friend. This kid was a doctoral student. He left Oxford 8 years ago. I'm still his mentor. And I'm going to see him probably tomorrow because he just sent me a text the other day. He knew I was in the area. That's the most rewarding thing in my life, I think, is the fact that you never aren't the mentor. And you grow every time. So read the book.
I don't have a book.
Will soon.
Working on it. However, one of the opportunities that Needles Eye has looked at seriously over the last 2-3 years, and we've had a couple of starts with it, is this very idea of mentoring. Back in 2002, a retired dentist came to the office and we had a conversation, and he didn't know what to do with the rest of his life. And he was concerned about that. I think his wife was more concerned about that. And so we talked about what his gifts were and what his interests were. And out of that, and out of about 4 or 5 other guys, came this ministry called Second Half, which now is a part of, I guess you could say it's under the Needles Eye umbrella, but he and a leadership team of retired guys are doing this with now about 175 retired. It's a guys thing right now. Soon, hopefully, not to be just a guys thing. And they are doing all sorts of wonderful stuff with regard to evangelism, discipleship within their own groups, small groups, and working in the community and caring for the least, the lost, and the lonely. They have a couple, 3 or so mentoring relationships going on. In my thinking, those are prototypical for what's going to happen, because it's been a thought that we've had for a couple of years at least to sort of match the second halfers with the YPers, or the millennials, that we're blessed to have a bunch of those young guys and gals as well. So we're looking at that, and I'm excited about the possibilities of that.
Well, actually, I've recently been assigned a mentor. She is, or mentee. She is on another account with my company in another state. So she's in Illinois, and we communicate. We have a conference call once a month, and I actually need to do a little homework before our call this week. So, like you were saying, I've found it's been very energizing, and she's actually challenging me to have my act together and have some things to talk about, so that I can present some things to her. But I feel like it's definitely a mutual, reciprocal relationship. But I wish I had more mentors coming up, and I still could use one myself.
Going back to what Lisa said about...
I'm sorry, where could you stand up?
I'm right here.
Up? Okay.
Hi. Going back to what Lisa said about just saying hello to people and being nice to people, I feel like a lot of people in this world, in this country, see somebody like that's picking up the trash, or somebody that's, just doing just different, what we consider menial tasks, as unimportant. And I feel even we as Christians do that. It's horrible. And I feel like even those people, I know the custodian that cleans my building, or my floor, and I know her name. And it allows me the opportunity to share the gospel with her. And I feel like we as workers, because we have, maybe, I guess, middle-class jobs, we don't look at people the way that God would look at them. And we need to just be open to talk to them too, because they need Jesus just like we need Jesus. Or, from my experience, because my dad owned a custodial service for 25 years, and he shared the gospel more than anybody else. Amen. He walked around because it was his business. He didn't care. He just did what he had to do. And it's just like he had more opportunity to share the gospel because he was loving on people. So it's just like we need to make sure that we love people too. Do you have any, yeah.
I couldn't improve on that. That's exactly right.
I was going to ask a question, but then Mia, you made a comment, and Ken, you made the comment as well.
I'm sorry, where are you?
Right back here.
Okay.
What's funny is this idea of treating people with value, and you talk about these companies that do a great job. I think about Jerry, and it's going to sound funny, you guys don't kill me because I know we're a bunch of Redskins fans in here, but Jerry Jones, they did an interview, and they interviewed a bunch of people who worked for the Dallas Cowboys about 10 years ago. And when they were interviewing the guy in the locker room, they said, "What do you do for the Cowboys?" He said, "I help them win Super Bowls." And they went to the guys who pumped up the footballs, and they said, "What do you do for the Cowboys?" He said, "I help them win Super Bowls." And so what Jerry Jones did was he created this culture with this organization where everybody felt valued and they understood that their work contributed to something bigger, which was everybody was working towards helping the Cowboys win a Super Bowl. And so I think you empower people when you treat them with dignity as well, and you get a better work ethic out of them. The question I had, though, is what is, and I'm curious, and the other folks up there, what does the workplace of the future look like? So like I work for a very large bank, and a lot of where we're moving is work from home. So then you don't have a workplace necessarily because now you're isolated in your home, right? So I don't know if there's any thoughts, or like I know we're moving to like shared workspaces and stuff like that. Do you have any thoughts on like what does the future workplace look like? So just a question.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And companies like Steelcase and whatnot, they spend a lot of time researching this because, it used to be everybody came to an office and they all had, 600 square feet or something, and now the workspace has gotten smaller and smaller, and half the people don't come to work, so their market has gotten a lot smaller. So they're always asking that question. And I think the answer is multifaceted. It's not going to be an either or. You're going to find a lot more collaborative work, that's guaranteed. You're going to find a lot more interdepartmental work. The traditional silo model is dying very quickly because the cycle time to bring a product to market is being reduced from what used to be 30 months to about 6 months in most industries. The competition is so fierce. So you don't have the luxury of, I did something in my silo, I pass it off to that silo, you do your thing, you pass it off, and then by the time it comes back to me, it doesn't even look like what I gave to them, and we're starting over. What's happening is the way buildings are being designed, the way offices are being designed, the way technology is being used, is they're getting people together in these collaborative groups in a very egalitarian way. And everybody is having a voice. And that's one of the things, by the way, which is driving an uptick in how people find work fulfilling, because their opinion really matters. Companies have found out that if you listen to your employees, they have more knowledge than you realize. So I think collaboration is key, and I think it's going to be a constant back and forth between on-site and off-site, but I don't think it's ever going to be completely one or completely the other. In fact, a lot of companies that in the last 10 years went to home-based are starting to bring people back because they're finding they're losing the serendipitous contact. And very often creativity happens in serendipitous moments, not in planned moments. And I would give one bit of business advice, if I may, be so brave. Have less meetings. Have less meetings. But more opportunities for interaction.
That's basically what I do every day, is figure out how to co-locate and bring teams together, utilize space. As you mentioned, people are coming back to the office, but instead of having private offices, you're creating more open spaces and lounge spaces, collaborative spaces, using technology to be able to communicate, whether that team is up in Northern Virginia or across the country. And you're seeing, like you said, this idea of agile teams, people that are coming together, working across different disciplines, being able to iterate and change and make adjustments quickly before you go out to market with something. So it does require a lot of, I feel like you have to kind of keep up with technology and change and be able to adapt and be agile, as the term is, which can be challenging, but that is kind of the pace, I think, that the workplace is taking.
I think we've probably exhausted everybody. No? Do we have one more? Do you pointing to someone? Okay.
I have one more question. You talked about the atheist that you had dinner with that the church created.
Richard Dawkins?
Yes, sir.
Yep.
And so my question is, how do we speak to people who have been hurt by the church is the first part. And second of all, as the church, how do we avoid the problem to start with?
That's a great question. The first thing is, don't pretend they weren't hurt by the church.
Okay.
Right? Truth and reconciliation. We have to admit the church has done a lot of damage to a lot of people. It just has. And very often for righteous thinking reasons, right? But then in retrospect, you find out that actually, if they had to choose between righteousness and grace, grace should always win. It's not that we don't value righteousness, we do. But if you look at the example of Jesus and the woman who was about to be stoned for being caught in the act of adultery. One of our students at Gordon-Conwell came up with a wonderful tagline for that particular passage of Scripture, and that is, protection should always precede correction. That's a great tagline. Protection should always precede correction. Jesus said to the woman, "Go and sin no more." But first, he protected her, even though the crowd was technically right. They were righteous in the law. They had every right to stone her. And Jesus steps in and says, this isn't about your right, and it isn't about what is right. It's about this human being created in the image of God, who he was about to die for. So I think that's the first thing we have to do. And if we get that right, we will have less situations where we hurt people, where the church hurts people. And I have to tell you, when I've seen the church really do the most damage is not when it's made a mistake, it's when it's become intransigent in the mistake, because no one likes to admit they're wrong. So what did I say about grace? Grace is just as hard to accept as it is to give. But I think that's the only way to avoid creating more Richard Dawkins. And you should pray for Richard Dawkins. You should pray for Richard Dawkins that he becomes like A.N. Wilson, a very famous, prominent non-believer who, with a brilliant mind, wouldn't it be wonderful if the scales fell from his eyes and we picked up the newspaper one day and it said the world's most prominent atheist has accepted Jesus Christ. Wow, that would be pretty amazing.
Can we have a hand for these two people who have